welcome to the closing session of our Health and Human Rights in the Climate Conference, focused today on defending our future. I'm Justine Nolan and I'm the Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute here at UNSW Sydney, and I welcome you on behalf of the conference co-conveners, USC's Institute on Inequalities in Global Health and the George Institute for Global Health for our very last session. Well, what a marathon it's been, or perhaps it just feels like that behind the scenes. Over the last 9 days, we've showcased some really remarkable people and ideas. And with the lineup we've had, it feels a lot like COP26 is going to just be a sideshow to our main event. With the very start of our opening session, Dr. Danny Larkin set the tone for our discussion by stressing the intimate interconnections between Indigenous people in the land and the state of our health. And as she noted, she said that the land cares for and provides for us, but we too need to nurture it to keep that relationship sustainable. So over the last week, we've seen a lot of discussion. There have been many recriminations, frustrations, but also optimism expressed about what we are doing and what we should be doing to tackle the climate crisis and mitigate its impact on our health. As noted yesterday by artist Janet Lawrence, we are all right now living in the emergency department of the climate crisis, and there is really no more time to stand by and hope for change. We need to be the force of that change. And I hope that's what we're going to illustrate here today with our young climate activists. The last 2 years of the COVID pandemic has really felt like, we've been involved in the worst ever group project on a global scale. And so we just cannot let climate be another one of those. So it really is with great optimism that we launch into this final session of the conference, featuring young students and activists who are working to defend our future. This session will be open with some brief reflections from 3 students from each of our institutes, and will be followed by a vibrant discussion with 3 climate activists who've made it abundantly clear that they will not be denied their future by inaction on climate. So let's start with our 3 students. Today we have William Dardell from USC's Institute on Inequalities in Global Health, Isabella Smith from the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW, and Kenneth Yakubu from the George Institute for Global Health. So over to you, Will.
Hello, everyone. My name is Will Dardell, and I'm a researcher at the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. It is an honor to be speaking today as one of the 3 rapporteurs bringing together all of the incredible discussions over the past 9 days. And thank you to the speakers for providing an eye-opening conference on the many challenges we face, but also potential solutions. At the start of this conference, Helen Clark framed the urgency of what we are dealing with perfectly, reminding us that each day, each week, each month, each year, it becomes tougher to address climate change and reverse the path that we are currently on. After all that has been said, it is evident that it is not a matter of if we frame climate change as a disease, but whether, when, and will the world take notice. Climate change is a clear threat to health and to human rights and should be framed as such and must be addressed with the same sense of urgency we've seen in other crises. The key question of who is most impacted and who is responsible has been at the forefront of all of our conversations. Who does climate change most impact? Whose health is and will be impacted? Whose rights are and will be impacted? Who is responsible for addressing climate change? Who are the actors that need to be at the table to address health and well-being of all people, especially those who are most at risk? And ultimately, who is accountable? Who holds governments and corporations to account? And who should be brought to justice for not addressing these issues and their impacts on people's right to health? Inequalities run rampant when it comes to health, as we continue to see during the COVID-19 pandemic. Marginalized populations who are too often left behind are being pushed further into vulnerable situations that negatively impact their health. We are already in a period of increased airborne illness, heat-related injuries, water, food, and sanitation insecurity, to name a few, and a period of reduced capacity to cope with the many health and rights threats around the world. Now add climate change. Dr. Mofokeng brought forward how we cannot talk about a healthy environment without talking about healthy people. Too often, voices have been left out of the conversation, and leaders like Nolene Nabu-Libo have reminded us that the lived realities and knowledge of Indigenous communities are what need to be the center of the path forward. These issues are gendered, they are rights issues, and they are complex. We know already that we can no longer think of human rights and health as just guaranteeing populations access to health services, to care that is of high quality, to information on health risks and technology, to participate in health continuum, and so on. We must now add a new layer with a focus on populations who are forced to migrate because of climate disasters and the ability to participate in achieving the highest standard of health as climate change adds significant challenges. During session 6, Julia Gaspari brought to attention the urgent need for information around human rights, climate change, and health to be digestible and less technical so that all can and will benefit from this knowledge. All human rights described to be critical for health by every speaker are now more difficult to achieve alongside climate threats. However, this presents a clear opportunity for linkage around the current understanding of rights, of health, and current knowledge of climate change, and how these three must now become an interlinked framework to improve health and well-being. Challenges may seem overwhelming, but it is evident through the discussions we've listened to that solutions are here too. They are available and they can make a difference. First of all, there is activism and the use of health and human rights impact assessments as discussed by Fiona High. As we heard from so many speakers, human rights and legal frameworks, accountability mechanisms, and most excitingly, the ability of art to create cultural and societal change. Janet Lawrence eloquently stated that art has the ability to transform and to help us imagine how change can happen. In the words of Rhonda Clark, it is now our responsibility to build communities where people think things are possible. All of this has showcased that the WHO is all of us, for all of us, because climate change impacts health for all of humanity. As we move past the incredible conversations that have taken place over the past few days, we must all take the next step of not only identifying solutions to addressing and improving health outcomes, but offering support to one another and to push as hard as we can while momentum is there and for the rest of our lives. In the words of Greta Thunberg, take us from the blah, 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 and into the next phase of utilizing the knowledge we have and make lasting change that positively impacts the physical and mental health and well-being of all of humanity, not just those who are easiest to reach. Famously, we say over and over again that the world is on fire, but it is human health and well-being that is burning. What will we do about it? Thank you, and I will now turn it over to Isabella.
Thank you. I want to begin by acknowledging the Bidjigal people, the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking to you from, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might be listening in today. I'd like to share with you my reflections on the conference as a student at UNSW Law and a soon-to-be lawyer on the role of law, domestic and international, in the way forward on climate change. Just this week during the conference, the Australian Prime Minister announced a plan for net zero by 2050 and boasted that this plan was not legislated and would not force the hands of Australians. Within the conference, however, so many have pointed directly or indirectly to the role of law, among a mix of other policy settings and market mechanisms, in a plan for climate action, and a plan that does not leave behind the most vulnerable or cause more harm than we already have. Many speakers have spoken to the need for justice in various forms and with different language. Climate justice, a just transition, or a transition to justice. Although the law is not always just and in many ways has held us back in climate action, it's also one lever we must pull to achieve climate action and justice. At the international level, many speakers have discussed the importance of cross-pollination between human rights law and international environmental and climate law. Flavio Bustreo and others spoke to the recent recognition of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment by the Human Rights Council. And although not legally binding, this makes crystal clear to our decision makers that our human rights and our lives depend on the health of the environment. International law creates access to, among other things, treaty body complaints, judicial remedies, creates a standard of political accountability for states, and also opportunities for advocates to put the human face of climate change in the face of decision makers, as Ashfaq Khalfan said. However, challenges with compliance and enforcement demonstrate the importance of implementation at the domestic level. Human rights law not only describes legal instruments, but also a framework, approach, or lens to integrate into a plan for climate action in international and domestic law and policy. Core concepts of human rights law and a human rights-based approach, which many of the speakers have described in their own discipline-specific language, offer a vision of a just and fair way forward. Many speakers spoke about equality and non-discrimination, and the disproportionate rights impacts for vulnerable and marginalised groups, including First Nations peoples, Pacific peoples, children, and women and girls, among many other groups. Participation is also another core concept which centres these experiences in decision-making. Toleng Mofokeng also spoke to the interdependence and indivisibility of rights through the example of the right to health and its dependence on the enjoyment of so many other rights, particularly social, economic and cultural rights. Law is also uniquely well suited to provide accountability, such as providing remedies, including compensation. These core concepts of human rights require solutions to the climate crisis that cut across disciplines, sectors, spheres of life, and are responsive to intersecting vulnerabilities. And finally, in the context of the inaction of our leaders, and within the constraints of the law, advocates and activists have found creative ways to use the law for the public good and bend it in the favour of the rights and climate agenda. Bryn O'Brien spoke to the ACCR's work, where shareholders are putting themselves in the way of business within the constraints of corporations law and shareholder rights. Climate litigation, including on the basis of human rights, has been an avenue for accountability and applying pressure to states and business, including through the efforts of young climate activists, of course. I think in the end, law is only one lever and one tool in the toolbox, but it's an important one to tackle the wicked problem and existential threat of our time, and also to ensure quality of life and dignity for all. Thank you, and I will pass to Yakubu. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabella. Hi, everyone. It's a privilege to share with you. My name is Yakubu, and I speak to you from Gadi Land here in Sydney, Australia. So as this conference draws to a close, some of us might be asking the what's next question. I'll admit navigating the issues of climate change can be a daunting task, but it's not an impossible one. We've heard from Helen Clark that it's economically, geophysically, and technologically possible to meet the ambition of the Paris Agreement. We've been encouraged by V to take all we've had from this conference and use it to relocate meaning outward into a shared process of rehabilitation. You may have had the speakers describe the dire consequences of not achieving net zero emissions, but they also shared stories of kinship and connectivity, efforts from the front lines that are geared towards transformational change. As academics, civil society organizations, and those interested in climate justice, we must keep demanding that state actors take the right decisions to respond to the climate crisis, but these have to be actions that lead us to a just and rapid transition. We'll be criticized for our ideals, but rather than retreat to the safety of those who think and talk like us, we must constantly seek ways to engage the skeptics. It has to be about healthy dialogue, healthy engagement. In this conference, the speakers have argued brilliantly for the indivisibility of human rights, but now it's time to close ranks. It's time for coalition building throughout the climate justice and human rights movements. As Mijin Cha and Nolan Abeliva shared, we can do without the silos. We can break out of the ivory towers. We can roll up our sleeves and work with community groups to build power locally and center directly impacted stakeholders. Indeed, we can work with unions to clearly define what a transition to justice looks like. That fine balance between the reduction of emissions and having good quality jobs. We can do more to support the right to sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous communities, promoting what they already know about achieving environmental justice. There's so much more that we can do. We can promote co-governance models between community groups, business owners, and corporate leaders. And there may be those who say it's not possible, but Toleng Mofokeng reminds us that we can look back to centuries-long examples of sustainable Indigenous practices to model our industries after. We can encourage our governments and business owners to invest in social protection schemes to mitigate the impact of climate change. Beyond screening for vulnerability, health impact assessment tools can become instruments for promoting collective thinking and action, bringing together health professionals, community groups, and the government. Fiona Hayes argued brilliantly for how these tools can form a template for integrating human rights principles, promoting a dimension of accountability in the language of rights and responsibilities. Those of us in the health sector may refer to our lack of legal expertise as a reason for staying out of these engagements. We may complain of the legality of rights-based approaches to change, but we can't deny the need to protect our collective rights to a healthy and safe environment, our right to life, our right to health. So there has to be a way of interpreting and incorporating rights-based approaches into existing health and social care services. If we still argue that this is not our responsibility, we cannot argue our way out of providing leadership for a resilient health system, of reducing the waste we produce in our health facilities. Climate change will increase the demand on health services, so we must lend our voice to efforts aimed at ensuring a sustainable global health workforce. A workforce that is trained, equipped, and motivated to respond to the change in disease and illness patterns that accompany global warming. Ladies and gentlemen, we may leave this conference concerned about how much we have not achieved in the fight for climate justice. I hope we also leave inspired by these words, that what seems like a depressive set of circumstances could instead be represented as a joyful accession of hope. Thank you so much for listening. I'll turn over to Justin.
Thank you so much, Yakubu. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Isabella. And just listening to the three of you, I already feel better about and a bit more secure about what's to come and our future, knowing that the three of you are on the case. So thank you so much for your involvement in the conference. I'm now pleased to introduce Rebecca Gilsonen, who's the Executive Director and Principal Lawyer from Maurice Blackburn Lawyers, who's one of our principal sponsors of the conference. Rebecca is one of Australia's leading class action lawyers and also holds a number of public interest roles, including serving on the Human Rights Institute's Advisory Committee. Maurice Blackburn is a really long-term supporter of the Australian Human Rights Institute and the Australian Human Rights Centre, which preceded that. So very thankful for your involvement, Rebecca, in our work and the support of your firm. So let me hand it over now to Rebecca to get the final session of the conference underway. Thanks, Rebecca.
Morning, and thank you, Justine. I'm speaking to you from Gadi Land, and I lend my support to the acknowledgements that have been made this morning. Thank you, William, Isabella and Kenneth, for your insights. You did a terrific job of drawing together the wealth of information and perspectives that have been shared throughout this conference, and also for offering some plans for action and reasons for optimism. It couldn't be a more pivotal time in Australian politics than now to be having this conversation. Our Prime Minister will have barely made it to the table at this year's COP26 Global Climate Summit, having signed the pledge just a week before the summit commences. Some would say that he was shamed into going to Glasgow by the unlikely triumvirate of Malcolm Turnbull, the Queen, and an expat comedian who bought a billboard in Times Square. At the level of the federal government, at least, Australia is an entitled straggler on climate change. But now, of course, we've made a plan to make a plan. The plan is that we'll have net zero emissions by 2050. We're yet to see how the Morrison government will deliver on the very important targets for 2030, which is a clear objective of COP26, let alone how we'll achieve net zero by 2050. We'll have to make a plan to make a plan to make a plan about that one at some stage. What is most interesting to me is that in Australia, we really are seeing the power of decentralised leadership on one of the grand challenges of our lifetime, and this really is by necessity. As Isabella pointed out to us, the civil society organisations and the lawyers are working together to try to make some inroads, to pull the levers, to force polluters and the government to account, and to act to protect the future. In the legal realm in Australia, we've recently seen some ambitious actions and some real progress. We've seen the Sharma case, the O'Donnell case, ACCR's case against Santos, and just this week, a class action was commenced by the First Nations people of the Torres Strait Islands, in which they argue that the Australian government has a duty to protect them from climate change. The courts are now being asked to explore the duties of business and the government in relation to climate change. And that's where a firm like mine, Maurice Blackburn, is seeking to play a role. We've recently celebrated our 100-year anniversary, but more than ever, we're focused on the next 100 years. Our aim is to extend access to justice and to use litigation to bring about change, holding corporations and governments to account. The reality is, though, that it's still very challenging to address climate change through the courts. It's harder still to seek compensation for environmental damage. We've had some success. For example, we're representing Indonesian seaweed farmers whose livelihoods were destroyed by an oil spill in Australian waters, and we're very hopeful of securing compensation for them. But legal action can only be part of the strategy, because who wants to wait until the damage is done? And the truth is, what you are all doing matters so much more in many cases, as it seeks to catch the problem at a much earlier stage than the legal system is currently equipped to do. I'm just in awe of the work that I've been hearing about through the course of this conference, and would like to pause and congratulate the Australian Human Rights Institute for bringing together such a terrific array of perspectives on this crucial issue at this crucial time. It really is an honour for Maurice Blackburn to be able to support the conference. And I really look forward to this next panel discussion, because it's been the activism by the next generation leaders around the world that has been the most vocal and the most arresting on this issue. They're gaining traction, and that really gives me hope. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Tegan Taylor. Tegan is a health and science reporter for the ABC and co-host of the ABC's multi-award-winning Coronacast. Tegan is a regular on ABC Radio National's Health Report and has been known to pop up on Radio National's Life Matters, Triple J, and the Best of Australian Science Writing. In 2020, Coronacast won a Walkley Award and a Eureka Prize for Science Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Tegan. Thank you.
I feel very welcomed. Thank you, Rebecca. Hello from Yagara and Turrbal Land here in Brisbane. I'm going to introduce our panel, and they're an impressive bunch, so bear with me. Firstly, we've got Belyndar Rikimani. She's the Vice President of Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change, a youth-led organisation whose members are students from the Pacific Island countries. After seeing the impacts of climate change on her community in the Solomon Islands, she's become dedicated to empowering, educating and advocating for vulnerable communities in the Pacific. Belyndar has recently joined the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, PECAN, as a network engagement officer. PECAN aims to build a network of non-governmental organisations in Pacific Island countries to help strengthen climate change advocacy in the region. She also co-leads a pilot project on climate diplomacy, where she works with young Pacific leaders and pairs them with senior Pacific climate negotiators to build their capacity around the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change processes and COP negotiations. Alexandria Villasenor is a climate activist based in Manhattan, New York, but at the moment she is in Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference COP26. Thanks for getting up at whatever time it is at the moment there. After her experience with the Paradise Fires in California, she began to petition for stronger climate action through the school strike for climate protests. She's a member of Children versus Climate Crisis, a group of 16 children petitioning the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child to hold France, Germany, Brazil, Argentina and Turkey to account for their failure to meet their reduction targets that were pledged under the Paris Agreement. She's the founder and executive director of Earth Uprising, a non-profit dedicated to young people tackling climate change. Alexandria is also a contributor in All We Can Save, a book dedicated to the diverse voices of women in the climate action movement. She was named as one of 17 Magazine's 2020 Voices of the Year. And Banok Rind is a proud Barimaya Yamachi woman from Western Australia, but she's currently based in Melbourne. Banok is a registered nurse with an extensive background in Aboriginal health, including working alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in areas of policy, advocacy and mentoring. She's a 2018 Posh Fellow alum, and Banok has recently worked at the Koori Youth Council as their Deputy Executive Officer and has taught First Nations health at various universities. So, panel, let's get into it. And in 2019, climate action really seemed poised on a precipice, and then COVID-19 came along and dominated the media discourse. On one hand, it's shown how agile governments can be when they want to be, but it's also really displaced the climate debate to an extent. And so I wanted to start with Belyndar. You've seen the effects of climate change with your own eyes in your own community. Was there a particular turning point for you to take up climate activism? Belyndar, are you there? We can't hear you. I might actually then go to Alexandria.
Hi,
Go for it, Belyndar.
Hi, Tegan. Sorry, I was having internet instability that couldn't get me through. But yeah, thank you for the question. It's a pleasure to be on the panel for today. So my experience on being as seeing the first-hand effects of climate change is that from where I came from my home island, climate change is something that we see every day. It's something that we deal with every day, and it's something that we can't, live without, because it's just in front of our communities. And the thing that actually pushes me to stand up and advocate for climate change is that, coming from like many of the communities in the Pacific, we don't really understand what climate change is. Like, we see it, but we don't understand it. So climate education is something that not every young people or every people in our place, they have the access to go through. And so I was like being in a place where I see there's flash flooding happening, and it's becoming very worse, where it kind of comes in and then like every people have to go out because it destroys the entire village. And I had to go to communities where people have to relocate inland because they don't have a safer place to live. So I see that, and I had to kind of get my head around it to see if this is something that is natural, or it's something that it's something that comes well, we can say human induced in some ways. So coming to university was an eye-opening for me. So I had to like going through law school, I get to see that climate change is not something that we as Pacific Islanders are responsible for. Like, we've seen the amount of greenhouse gas emission that is going up by all those major big emitting countries that, that always give us more funding for recovery, but they're the ones that are actually causing the climate change, So I see that it's something that we have very little contribution to, yet we are the ones that are suffering it. So that kind of really pushed me and motivated me to be vocal for especially women that are out there in my community that are suffering the climate crisis at a very severe stage and that don't have the platform and the space to speak out. So that is one of the things that actually pushes me to become a young woman that actually strongly advocates for climate change in terms of those that are vulnerable, like those the ones that are disabled, that are the communities that don't have the access that we have to actually be vocal for them. So that is one of the things that kind of motivates me to be in the climate space.
It's so interesting you said that about education and that people are seeing it, but they don't necessarily understand it. And I wanted to come to you on that, Banok, because you've worked in capacity, Belyndar has as well, but you've worked in capacity building in communities. Can you talk about what that involves and why it's so important? There you are.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose I want to acknowledge the land I'm on today, Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to all people of the Kulin Nations who have welcomed me to their beautiful country the last 9 years, and extend that to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I think in terms of capacity building and what I've seen working with so many different communities is just quite similar to Belyndar. I think we see so many different communities that are seeing the effects of, climate change, but, having an understanding of, okay, we know why this is happening, but we also don't know why it's happening. A few weeks ago, I work at the USC Institute. We hosted a roundtable, and that roundtable consisted of, the power of storytelling. So we had so many different experts from different communities coming and sharing their stories. And we had this one uncle from Tennant Creek, and he came and he shared the story of, the community having 30 days or 40 days or 50 days straight of just heat where it's over 40 degrees. and that impacts access to electricity. And every Monday, they know if the weather's really severe, over 45 degrees, they don't have access to electricity. And that's actually the impact of the heat in that community and the impact of climate change. So there's all of this, there's a thorough understanding of climate change in Aboriginal communities, but I think in recent times we've had the solution for thousands of years. So in terms of capacity building, I think it's more so other communities learning from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and what we have been doing for thousands of years. You know, our old people say when country is sick, we are sick. And, you know, it's not just limited to us in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, but climate change is everyone. So when we're looking at solutions and simple access, you know, we have so many of these solutions. For example, the bushfire response 2 years ago, and the effects of the bushfires on so many different communities, to, you know, the Aboriginal communities advocating and you know, protesting, saying we have the solutions, you just really need to work with us. So yeah, just looking at different ways and solutions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have advocated and still do advocate for. We have the solutions, we are here, but again, it's a means of cross collaboration, because it's no more about me, it's about us. How do we do this together?
I love that idea of the capacity building is coming from Indigenous people to the greater community. Alexandra, I wanted to ask you, because in other spaces, especially around diversity initiatives, the burden of taking action often falls on the minority group that's already at a disadvantage. And I wondered if that's something that you see happening in the climate space when it comes to young people, people who are going to live for the longest with the impacts of this, what it would take to get older people involved more in this space.
I think that intergenerational organizing and cooperation is so important, and it's so important that we have people of all ages coming together. And so we've talked a lot about education already on this call, but I really do think that education is one of the key ways to do that. We really work to teach new youth coming into the movement about our differences, and as well as about how to empower each other and work together. And then also working with adults and telling them how they can support our movement. And so it's really important that we have conversations intergenerationally and talking to adults about how they can support our movement and what type of actions they can do to support us, amplify us, help get our message out there to more people, and as well as amplify us in any certain spaces. And going up into COP, I've seen so many great adults actually try and amplify youth and make sure that our voices are being heard. And so there's a lot that youth can learn from adults, and there's also a lot that adults can learn from youth, because there's been those who have come before us for generations and have wisdom that they can share with us. But then also you think outside of the box, and we have our own message to share. And I think that there's a lot that everyone can learn from each other. And then this is also where intersectionality comes in, because intersectionality is our strength. And as well as going up to these big climate conferences, it's important that we have people from every single group, which means that we have representation from all different cultures and all different countries as well. And so we won't get the solutions that we need without intergenerational organizing and intersectionality as well.
So you can ask your questions. I'm talking to our lovely audience out there by entering them in the chat. We've actually got some questions coming through already, which I'll get to in a moment. But Banok, I wanted to ask you about what Alexandria was just saying about intergenerational knowledge sharing, because that's something that Indigenous Australians do incredibly well. Like, are there models that we can take from that space into the climate space specifically?
Yeah, I was smiling when Alexandria was talking, because we had these conversations last week, but also these have been ongoing conversations that I've just been hearing my whole life anyway. Intergenerational collaboration, if you want to put a title to it, is something that I've heard quite commonly in the last few months and the recent years. And basically it's looking at, working alongside, the young people and teaching the young people and passing on those knowledges that have been around for thousands of years. And so I suppose in terms of modelling, one thing that we also need to be mindful of when it comes to this area of expertise is, Indigenous people and intellectual property and protecting that knowledge and those knowledge systems. But in terms of intergenerational collaboration and cross-collaboration with non-Indigenous communities and looking at modelling like that, I think, as I mentioned before, for example, the bushfires and Aboriginal communities saying, we've been doing this for thousands of years in our different communities. We do burning at a certain period of time, just so when it comes to bushfire season, it's not as drastic as it was. So I think the key step would be sitting down and listening to Aboriginal communities, strategizing, okay, so this is coming up, so many different communities in far north Queensland and parts of WA are actually having the effects of sea levels rising as well. I know in parts of the Torres Strait and hearing from friends that it's impacted their communities already. So it's about, okay, we've got the community solutions. How can we make governments, policy decision makers listen to that? And when we're looking at modelling, we need to have a modelling approach that's self-determined, that actually emphasises on collaboration, but it also elevates the voices of community members, because the communities are the ones that are living through it.
Yeah, and that thing of communities, there's a question that we've received from the audience, which I might actually put to Belyndar, saying, how do we ensure that we are amplifying and encouraging young voices on climate change from all around the world, particularly those regions where climate change is likely to have the greatest adverse effects? Belyndar, do you want to take that one? Belyndar? Alexandria, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So to answer that question, we have to get them in the room and we have to stop excluding them. And in particular, one focus that I have a lot right now is we're actually in the youth climate movement, we are really concerned about this COP because representatives from the global south have been restricted from attending, as well as a lot of youth. And so we know that if we don't have the people from the most affected areas and spaces in the room, then we won't end up reaching the right solutions that we need. And so actually, when the most affected communities are excluded from these negotiations, we're more likely to delay climate action altogether, which is devastating for these communities and for the planet. So excluding these communities leads to something called predatory delay. And so right now, we have to really focus on making sure that communities are represented, because that will really change the outcomes and the solutions that we get. And so going forward, we have to do, or governments have to do a lot better at including that are being affected by the climate crisis, because right now this COP is looking to be the most exclusive COP we've ever had. And as the climate crisis gets more extreme and we see more of the effects of it, we can't exclude these communities. They need to be in the room in the decision-making processes. And so that's one thing that we really have to call out and make sure that our governments are held accountable to make sure that the right people, the ones who are being affected, the ones who have the most to share, are in those rooms.
And I think we've got Belyndar there as well. Your thoughts?
Hi, Tegan. Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm so sorry, my internet was very unstable earlier. On the question, I do agree with what Alexandria said, is to provide a space for young people. I think that's what we need to do at the moment, support them, whatever support you can do through funding, through just giving them the space to talk, or providing conferences like this where you could actually hear youth's voice talking about what they have been through. It's something that we youths, we need to have at the moment. And for us in the Pacific, just like Banok have stated, they have that culture of storytelling. And for us in the Pacific, we have that, we call it the Talanoa session, where we get to share our Indigenous knowledge with each other. And for us, Indigenous knowledge is something that is very important. And it's something that is very kind of like it is our identity that is within us. Our traditional knowledge holds a bigger picture of how we are and how we have been throughout the past years. And to fight against climate change, it is something that we need to kind of revive our traditional knowledge again and actually incorporate it with the solutions that we're working on at the moment. So for us to have a space in conferences or any platform that you see, you could see a place where youths could actually voice out their concern, give it to the youths, because like we are the next generation, and we are the youths at this moment. We are a generation of peacemakers, of advocates, of activism that have the power to make a difference. So provide us with a space, and we will say what we want to say, and that could also help influence the policies that our governments are doing at the moment.
While I've got you, Belyndar, because I know that the internet's posing some challenges for us today, I'd love to talk about this theme of health and climate change and what you're seeing in your communities around the impact of climate change on the provision of healthcare.
Sorry, Tegan, was that question for me again?
Sure.
Yeah, all right.
What you're seeing about climate change and its impact on the provision of healthcare.
To be honest, climate change has been the impacts of climate change has really affected the Pacific communities in terms of healthcare in so many ways. I'd start it affects in terms of food security, our access to water. From where I come from, my home island, I used to walk roughly 2 kilometers to get fresh water to drink, and it's something that I've been doing since I was a little girl. Until now, we are still doing it, and I don't know how it will stop, because due to climate change, the water that we are accessing, it's going very limited. It's drying up because of the increase of heat that we're experiencing, and in the next 10 years, I don't know how my people can survive with water in terms of having the accessibility of clean water. I don't know what will happen in the next 10 years. Given the impacts of climate change, it's very severe every day. And in terms of food security, climate change has really affected our food production. People are going very far distances to garden now. So it's something that I don't know how we could actually, because everything changes and people are finding it very hard, and it causes frustration in our communities, and people are kind of at the point where they're fighting amongst each other because there is not enough resources for everyone to use, and we can't blame it, because this climate change crisis, it's something that we don't have the biggest contribution towards, but yet the impacts of it, we are the ones that are facing it. And I think that it's something that our leaders should actually see. They should actually see the importance of why we are really advocating and standing up for this issue, because we have seen the first-hand effects of it in our communities, and that is what kind of pushes us to be here and actually saying out our voice, preaching out what's happening, so that it could actually help influence the policies that they have, they have the political will to actually implement at their level.
Alexandria, the climate change has been in the public discourse for quite a while. You can go ahead and mute yourself if you like, Belyndar, just for the moment, because I know it's a bit noisy where you are. But Alexandria, do you think that now that the health impacts of climate change are becoming so evident, like Belyndar's painting it's a bleak picture, is it an easier sell to get parties on board when it's actually affecting humans really directly?
Definitely. I think that is one thing that has started to be talked about more, is that when we're talking about climate change and the effects, people relate more to it and they understand it more when they see how it's actually affecting them. And so that's one thing that I always tell people to do when they first get involved in climate activism, or before they even do that, is to find their climate story. And for example, I ended up getting involved in climate activism after seeing the wildfires in California. And I mean, since that first since that first time that I saw them, we see wildfires all year round now. We had our first ever fire in California. And so that poses a lot of health issues. Smoke inhalation can cause long-term health, and especially asthma like myself. And so when people understand how climate change is directly affecting them, then they end up wanting to get involved, and they feel a certain motivation. And I think that that's why it's important to have conversations with people and talk about what is happening, but then also talk about how it's directly affecting them, because that's really how you get people's attention.
You're in the health space, Banok. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, like, if I look at it from a public health point of view, everything is interconnected, and then looking at it from an Aboriginal perspective, once again, everything is interconnected. If we look at the models of health and healthcare, your social, your physical, your mental, and your spiritual health, they're all interconnected, because if one is down, then it's going to impact the other. But then in terms of looking at solution, and this is touching on a lot of things that Belyndar said and Alexandria said, is if we want to look at solutions, and I suppose build a messaging of build a messaging of, giving people the idea or the perception that, things are going to be okay if we have these messages in place, specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Maybe what we need is, an Indigenous leadership organisation that's already in health. Again, we already have the resources, but maybe that looks at, we need a leadership group on climate change that works alongside the government. That could look at a modelling. And if we're talking about, resourcing, how do we listen to local communities to develop specific plans and implement plans and take action? So touching on some of the things that Belyndar was saying in terms of water sustainability and access to water, which is a basic human right. Everyone should have access to water and food and shelter. And then we also have to think about, how are we going to make these solutions equitable and equally accessible for everyone? Because time and time again, and I always emphasise this point, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and peoples always get the short end of the stick, and we always get left behind. So if we're adding on added targets, especially climate targets in this country, how is that going to incorporate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership and voices? But how is that actually going to not burden the current existing targets that have been around for a very, very long time? Once again, we do have the solutions, but we also have to listen to communities, because we have communities telling us, communities in parts of WA and Northern Territory that don't have access to water because the water systems have actually been, they're toxic, they're contaminated with other chemicals and they can't drink it. So how can they get better filtration systems? How do they get better filtration systems? That's up to the government and working with the communities. So it really goes hand in hand, because, if we have Aboriginal communities that don't have access to electricity because of the heat, and some of these community members go to dialysis 3 times a week, so they travel in the heat, go to dialysis. That's also dependent on whether there's electricity or not. So it's all interconnected. And if we're looking at solutions, if we're looking at, the change that we want to see for young people, and, we're not just thinking of this generation now, we're thinking of the next 7 generations, then we should have been taking action 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago by these governments. I don't want to say it's late. It's too late now, but it would be really late in the next 3 or 5 years' time. So look at the leadership structures, look at how we can, cross-collaborate and collaborate between different intergenerational collaboration. We have to look at these things, because if we don't start now, and if country is sick, then we become sick.
And there's the physical side of it, which is absolutely undeniable, but there's also a mental health burden associated with climate change, but especially for you as activists. Alexandria, how do you manage that? It's a heavy burden.
Activist burnout, and there are can do to kind of reconnect and take time for yourself. So sometimes it's important to not work work constantly, because you got that sustainable if you're constantly working and taking that sort of action. And so it's always important to reconnect. And so what I do to prevent activist burnout is I connect with nature, I prioritize relationships, and I build community in the movement and locally. When you connect with nature, it's a reminder of what we're fighting for. I think that sometimes people talk about climate change and the environment, and sometimes we end up talking about it so much that we almost forget what we're actually fighting for. It almost becomes numb when we're talking about it all the time. And so reconnecting with nature reminds you what we're in this for. And then also having those relationships are important. Youth also need to have time to be with friends and family, because the relationships that we have with people are a support system. And that's how we end up doing this work for a long time. Like before getting to Glasgow, I actually spent some time in Loch Lomond and the Trossachs and on the Isle of Skye. And it was beautiful, and it recharged me so that I'll be doing this work now for 16 days straight, doing climate events and having this huge climate movement. We have so many actions going on, and so a bunch of meetings as well. So it's important to reconnect and recharge before we do this work, because this is a marathon. It's definitely not a sprint.
Yeah, but we need those places to be there so that you've got somewhere to recharge, which is why this work is, but one of the reasons why this work is so important. Banok, is there work that needs to be done in the climate activism space to make it culturally safe for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
I'm trying to find this point that I actually, we heard last week in one of the conversations that we were having. And I suppose if we're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and working with these communities, one, we do have systems that were built against us, not for us. So if we're actually looking at it from a structural and systemic point of view, there is the pre-existing structural and systemic racism. But if we want to have conversations about climate change and strategies to climate change, up until now, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have not been sufficiently included in the national conversation about climate change. So if we want to have these conversations, then you really need to start with community. I know I keep emphasising on this point, but it's a really important point. They need to start with community and the impacts of community. That's not looking at, limited to just rural and remote communities and regional communities, but also within the city as well. All Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities should be a part of the conversation, because once again, you have more than 60,000 years worth of knowledge, traditions and culture that is very much well and truly alive today. So why would you not want to have that incorporated into these conversations about climate change and the approach to addressing climate change, more so that it impacts everybody in this country, everyone in the world? The solutions are there, the strategies are there, but it's about having, so many different marginalised groups are part of the conversations, because more often than not, just like Belyndar was talking about, her people in the Solomon Islands and the impacts of, access to water, and I'm sure all of these other things, if you don't have community at the forefront, if you don't have these community advocates at the forefront, then you won't be able to progress with the conversation about climate change and how to address it.
And I've got a question for you, Belyndar, if you are there, an audience question. And of course, you can ask your questions in the chat, and we're going to take some more in the next 20 minutes or so. This person says, thank you, Belyndar, for sharing the concept of the Talanoa to capture traditional knowledge. As a Pacific Islander, this person says, my question to the panel is there an established platform to capture this type of information, to share best practices among affected communities or communities in general? Belyndar, are you there? Go ahead, Belyndar. Just while we're waiting for Belyndar, Banok or Alexandria, do you want to weigh in on this one?
What was the question again?
It was about the concept of Talanoa, this Pacific Island idea of sharing knowledge, but they're wondering whether there's established platforms to capture this type of information, to share best practices among affected communities. We might come back to that one. There's actually another question, and I think we'll start with you, Alexandria. Someone asking, would the panel recommend trying to take legal action at a local or domestic level to try to get governments to act on climate change? Or is this something that should be pursued at an international level, like what you've done with your complaint to the UN over climate action?
Definitely. I think that we need so many legal actions and complaints out there. And, just a little bit of history about mine, the Children versus Climate Crisis complaint, we ended up launching and filing that complaint in September of 2019. And more of the legal background on it, it was based on who signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the third protocol, optional protocol, which allows children to hold governments accountable. And so this past month, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child actually decided that our case was inadmissible and should be pursued in each individual country first. However, this actually violates international law because we proved that there weren't any pathways in some of these countries. And in others, we proved those pathways would be futile and there was no chance for accountability. So it's really concerning when the United Nations won't even hold nations accountable for the climate-fueled deaths of children around the world. And so a study actually found by UNICEF that 80% of global child mortality is linked to climate change and global warming. And children absolutely have the inherent right to life, which is what the Convention on the Rights of the Child states. And this convention is the most widely ratified treaty on the planet. And so we are looking at this petition to basically set a precedent. And when they ended up filing as inadmissible, right now that sets a precedent that they don't care about child's rights. And so we are still finding ways to take action. And this is not the end of the Children versus Climate Crisis complaint. We're still going to continue on in the work and make sure that they do something. But actions are so important to hold our governments accountable. And with Children versus Climate Crisis, we are simply asking that nations uphold the treaties that they've signed. And right now we're working on how to continue to push for our rights at the international level and through international law. However, we're not the only ones now, of course. And in the past 2 years, we've been joined by a group of youth from Portugal who are taking their complaint to the European Human Rights Commission. And there are more cases that are being launched every month. There are cases in Canada and Latin America and, of course, Australia. And so we need to find ways to hold our governments accountable in every area we can. So more legal actions are so, so important.
Yeah, there's the legal actions are sort of represented on this panel, although I should say Belyndar is in Vanuatu. She's had some pretty significant tech challenges, and if she joins us again, we'll come back to her in the case that she's bringing. And another one of the young activists here in Australia have brought, you're sort of at the UN level, Alexandria, and then also at the other end, we've got this sort of these groups of students who are bringing actions against a particular mine site, sort of saying that the Environment Minister has a duty of care. And I know that the legal avenues have been explored in some of the other sessions in this conference. But we've got a question again for you, Alexandria, about what is the flavour in Glasgow at the moment? Are youth well represented there? Like, what's your plan for making your voices heard?
Well, I've been in Glasgow for a day, but we are so excited and there are so many of us here. Right now, youth activists are starting at COI 16, which is the Conference of Youth. And it's 3 days of education and learning from each other. And we'll basically be preparing our global youth climate statements that we'll end up giving to those world leaders at COP. And then we're planning a series of protests. The largest one will be on November 5th. And so right now there's a lot of excitement for everything that's happening, but there's a lot of youth activists who are very critical of COP, of course. And so right now there's not a lot of hope for the outcomes from the governments and those world leaders at COP. But right now we have a lot of hope in each other. There's going to be so many youth here with each other and so many actions. And I mean, on the 5th, it's a march that will be joined by all of the striking labor organizations in Glasgow. And so there's so many movements that are coming together here as well that I think will make the energy here so high. And we've been fortunate to also get some high-level meetings with world leaders to make our voices heard. And so whether we're outside, whether we're inside, we will be making sure that they hear us.
That's really exciting to hear. I hope it goes well for you. Belyndar, I think we've got you back. And if we do, if you could take yourself off mute, I'd love to just give you the chance to talk a bit about the case that you're involved with Vanuatu, advocating for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the right of present and future generations to be protected from the adverse impacts of climate change. Are you there? Belyndar, feel free to take yourself off mute at any time and we'll come to you because I think your internet is precious and we need to seize it when we can. But Banok, to you, this idea of weighting of voices. Oh no, I think we've got Belyndar here. Go for it. Tell us about your case.
All right, thank you. I am so very not happy with the internet connection at the moment. Regarding the case, the advisory opinion that we are working on, it is an advisory opinion that we are seeking from the International Court of Justice, basically that is focused on climate change and human rights. And this in how we see this advisory opinion is that it could actually help to seek clarification on legal duties of large emitters of greenhouse gases, and that are countries that are contributing to the greenhouse gas that are affecting the climate crisis that we are in now. And we see that having this advisory opinion, which the Vanuatu government is taking a lead on, could actually help to provide an impetus for laws on the rights to self-determination, prevention of genocide, and also nuclear disarmament that the Marshall Islands are currently taking a lead on in terms of carbon, like shipping and carbon levy and all that. And we have seen that a push of an advisory opinion could actually be a help towards the global solution that we're all working at the moment. And even though it is not legally binding, yet it can be very instrumental in the development of international law, and that could influence in terms of climate litigation that a number of people are actually, or countries or youth advocates are taking at the moment. So that is why we see that there is a need for an advisory opinion. And we have also seen the past of other countries that have also pushed towards an advisory opinion as well in terms of other things. But for this, we see that given the large number of climate-related lawsuits that are happening now, we see that there is a great push that a legal opinion from the International Court of Justice could do to climate change.
Thanks, Belyndar. Yeah, this idea of setting precedents at like the international, local level. It's noisy where I am. So, oh my goodness, today. A question from the audience. This is to everyone, but I might see who wants to jump in first with it. This person asking, how do you deal with the criticisms of the climate change movement, that it's preaching to the converted, that the enormousness of the task is overwhelming and so it creates inertia, and that the self-interest and profit drivers of governments and corporations are winning over social movements? What are your thoughts on that? First in, best represented.
Tegan, can I jump in first?
Please do.
All right. I think for that, sorry, can you repeat the question? It was
criticisms of the climate change movement, things that it's overwhelming, there's inertia, that you're preaching to the converted, that you're never going to win over the giant profits that are involved. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Oh, yeah. Okay. In my case, I receive that a lot. I like the Pacific, like not just me, but also my other colleagues. They have gone through the same criticisms. Like, I think what we do is that we know what we are doing, and we stand for the rights of our people, and we know that this is something that we need to take our voices out there. So for me, the criticism of people is what motivates me to be here in this climate space. It actually pushes me to, do more and better and actually be out there. It's not something that's going to hold me back or push me or affect me in some ways, but it's actually one of the motivations that actually pushes me to grow and improve and actually reach out to people who actually could help me in this climate space. So that's basically how I deal with criticisms in my 4 years being in the climate space.
Alexandria?
Yeah, I second everything that has been said. To kind of add to that, after 3 years of organizing and protests, I've learned to ignore the naysayers and the climate deniers, and especially the climate delayers. There's only a small number of people, because actually the majority of people in many nations believe in climate change and understand that we need to take urgent action. So I think the first thing is to learn what to put my time into. And it's a waste of time to try and convince everyone about climate change. Right now, we need to focus on action. And so honestly, ignore those who are trying to deny or delay climate action, because it's not worth our time. We can be out there pushing for action and just ignore those people.
Banok?
Sorry, can you repeat the end of the question?
What's your response to the naysayers, the critics of the climate change and health movement?
Yeah, I think if you don't recognise the fact that it's impacting you, then you're probably quite oblivious to your surroundings. Because to simply put it, if you're not seeing, for example, in Melbourne alone, like we've had this huge thunderstorm overnight. A few weeks ago, we had an earthquake. We never get earthquakes, especially an earthquake that size. If you don't recognise these little signs and these little things, then I think you really need to see the broader picture of what's actually happening in the world. If you don't see what's happening in the Torres Strait, what's going to be happening to the Great Barrier Reef, the increase in bushfires, you have communities in parts of different parts of Northern Territory where, we had a community member say, we don't even see kangaroos anymore. It wasn't like this 5 years ago. And it's the impact of heat and heat exhaustion that's also affecting animals and the ecosystem of animals. So if you are oblivious to these things, then I think, one, you need to self-evaluate and self-reflect and think, okay, is all of these things are happening around me. It's not a coincidence, because climate change is real and climate change is happening now. And the other thing that I would say is, just looking at different parts of the world, and, you have all these different people and leaders now, addressing climate change and doing all these different conferences that address climate change. So maybe look at that as well. Now, whether or not, we have actions that are going to be implemented at an international level, at a national level, or a local level, we don't know that. But it's also the advocacy of community campaigners, community organisers, and all of these different people across the world that are trying to keep key decision makers accountable. And if you want to be a part of that, because this is your world too and you're living in it, then you really need to self-evaluate and self-reflect, so you know that it's going to be affecting you and future generations to come, because it is real and it is happening now.
So we've got COP just about to start. I would love to use these we've only got a few minutes left of this, but for each of you, if you had 1 minute with the people in that room, and Alexandria is just outside the room, what's your one message? And Belyndar, if you're there and if you can hear me, I'd love to start with you.
Hi, Tegan. I'm here.
Your one minute message to the leaders of the world.
Well, there's so many things that I want to say. I think for me, coming from the Pacific, I think climate justice is one thing. I wanted to see climate justice. I wanted leaders to actually push and stand for climate justice, because time is not on our side. We are running against time, and we don't have enough time to talk and talk. We actually need to be the doers of the word. We actually need to walk the talk at the moment. And that is what I want our leaders to do, is to step up, talk, and push for climate justice, because the future generation, they are at grave stake. Like you have the ability to influence change and use that change to actually make a sustainable future for our younger generation. So that would be my message for all our leaders that are attending COP.
Banok?
I suppose the key messaging that I would ask is, what's the world that you want to live in 20 years' time? Because if it's a world that you want to see greenery, you want to see rain, you want to see happiness, then what's the world that you want to live in 20 years' time? Because that will keep you accountable, and you would think of your future generations. And the other question that I would also propose is, how do you do that in an equitable and equal manner so everybody's included along the journey?
And Alexandria, what are you going to be shouting?
Well, I would be shouting that we have less than 10 years to reduce global greenhouse emissions by at least 50%, and we're on track to increase global emissions by 21% this year. So we are going in the wrong direction, and we need to start reducing emissions right now and center justice and equity at the core of all of our solutions. We have the tools, we have the solutions, we even have the finances to decarbonize our planet and protect people all around the world. We just need to choose to do this.
Thank you so much to our fantastic panel, Banok, Alexandria and Belyndar, specifically for the valiant efforts with the internet that Belyndar struggled with today. A really worthwhile discussion despite the tech issues. And now it's time for me to pass on to a familiar face from this conference, Sophia Gruskin, co-convener from the University of Southern California and director of the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health.
Thank you, Tegan. Thank you, everyone on the panel. That session was amazing, right? But honestly, I have to say the whole conference has been amazing. It's been an incredible mix of practitioners, of policymakers, of artists, of academics, of activists. I think all of us consider ourselves activists with this topic, and with folks from every continent, from different age groups, but all of us with a shared concern for what's happening to our planet and to the current and future impacts on the health and human rights of all people, and everybody trying to do something about it. And it's a really long road, and there is so much to do. But having this kind of community and sense of shared concern is something I really feel grateful for, and I think it gives real hope in some way. I have to take a second to thank my conference co-organizers, the wonderful folks at UNSW, Justine, Andy, Drew, Ali, the folks at the George, Kent, Chelsea, Jan, but the folks on my team at USC IIGH, in particular, Will Dardell and Jessica Santos. This conference has been a labor of love, and I'm so very glad to have worked on this all together. I'm really actually going to miss working together as we've been doing it over the last several months. And I feel like I have to thank all of you. The speakers for these sessions have been amazing. The participants, all of you have stuck with us. It's been incredibly energizing. And I think the one thing I want to say in closing before handing it off is that it's so easy to stay in our disciplinary, our geographical silos. And, we're all driven by this incredible need to do something in the lead up to COP26. And yes, we need to do all we can to make sure that health and human rights are front and center. Resources are key, of course, but we need everyone to focus on the health and rights of people. That's what truly matters, and we have to keep hammering on these connections. It's really up to all of us to ensure the pressure, though, doesn't stop once COP is passed. That's my biggest fear. We've got to hold our governments and businesses to account, and we have to ensure climate stays at the center of all of our concerns. Thank you all so much, and let me now turn it over to Kent Booz, who directs the Healthier Societies program at the George Institute for Global Health.
Thanks, Sophia, and greetings from Cambridge. It's been wonderful to be with you tonight. It's my night. Thanks to Will, Yak, and Isabella for so brilliantly bringing me up to speed on what you've covered during the past 9 days. Really remarkable. Can I just say that this session has been such a great way to close the conference. In my mind, we can't wait any longer for this next generation of climate leaders to get inside that room. Kudos to all of you. Let me start by thanking our partners and colleagues at the University of Southern California and the Australian Institute for Human Rights. And I won't name all of you, but you've done all the heavy lifting, and we're grateful for that. Before I make 3 points, I do want to acknowledge, however, one of my colleagues, Dr. Jan Shantosh, who was instrumental in organizing things from our side, and she couldn't be here this week because she's recently had a baby. It's a real shame, as she would have brought a great deal to the program in her capacity leading a new joint program on health and human rights that we are co-hosting together with Justine at the Australian Institute for Human Rights. Sorry. I'd also like to thank Shikumbuzu Mabunda, one of our talented PhDs, who contributed to the opening session, and of course, thanks to Yaks for your determined optimism this evening, and that optimism was obviously shared by the panel. So my 3 concluding remarks are as follows. As we've heard a lot about tonight, the conference has been taking place at a historic juncture with all eyes on COP26. And it comes also just 3 weeks after the Human Rights Council declared access to the healthy environment as human right. And I don't know how much the conference has dealt with this, but that right really reflects nicely the 3 themes of this conference that the conference has brought together. And like others, I really do hope that you use the knowledge and connections that you've made over the past 9 days as a springboard to seize the moment. And at the George, we would value and welcome collaborations in this space of rights, climate, and health. Second, I think that we all need to acknowledge that giving effect to this newly recognized right will be a huge challenge, and it will, and indeed it must, as we've heard tonight, be disruptive of the status quo. It really needs to be disruptive. And so this will require, of course, new kinds of collaboration, but I also agree with you, it's going to require contestation and, yes, at times confrontation. The panel has really shown us why I think we need to listen to the youth leaders, but we also need to listen to leaders of First Nations and Indigenous communities and other marginalized communities for that just and rapid transition to the climate-friendly future that we all seek. Third thing that I wanted to just stress is I agree with the optimism, and I think that there are huge untapped opportunities. There's opportunities in terms of working across disciplines, which is what we increasingly need to do within universities, but I think also increasingly building the coalitions that some of you talked about across universities and with civil society groups and activists, and to build broad coalitions that haven't necessarily worked together before. And I think there's huge opportunity in that. And then I think it behooves all of us to provide the support and to provide the resources to civil society and activists to put pressure on governments, and as Sophia said, on industry, to leverage human rights in the interests of the health of people and planet. So listen, I'm grateful for all of you coming together to share how we can move the agenda forward. Your intellectual contributions, I thank you for. I thank you for your leadership, and I thank you for your partnership. Justine, I don't need to introduce you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you, Sophia, too, for your great closing remarks. We have come to the end, and which you're probably as thankful for as we all are. But it has been an amazing, energizing 9 days, and this panel in particular does give me real optimism about where we go in the future. But I also sort of want to, call out, we can't put all the weight of this on the youth. They are doing an amazing job. But, Mandela and Gandhi weren't teenagers when they changed the world. So if you happen to be over 30, you're not off the hook on this. And so, as Alexandria said, we really need to be inclusive. We need as many people as we can in the room. And we all need to really hold, as Sophia said, our governments and businesses to account on this, that it is just simply not good enough to have a plan to do something in 29 years, that we have to take action now. What's been amazing about this conference is that it has brought together such a diverse group from health professionals, academics, lawyers, climate activists, that shows that there is a real need, as Kent said, to work together. I would also just like to add my thanks particularly to the 2 students from UNSW, Lubna Sharif and Isabella Smith, for their great contributions during the conference. and the simply amazing organising committee, as Sophia said. Sophia from USC, and from the George we had Jan Shantosh, Chelsea Hunniset, and Joshua Lakshmi as well. And from the Institute, Human Rights Institute, Andy Durbach, Drew Sheldrick, Oris Kalaf, and the ever calm Alison Nolan behind the scenes. Thank you very much for your work. And particular thanks also to Carly and her team at the UNSW production team, who have worked endlessly in this last week with internet dodgy connections from all around the world. But it was our goal to put up with bad internet because we wanted to be as inclusive as possible. And so we're really thankful that people like Belyndar came to us from Vanuatu today, struggling through the tech issues, and Banok from Melbourne, who the storm took out electricity, and Alexandria from Glasgow. We love all the work. We really hope you go on to kick some more ass over there in Glasgow, and you have all our support. So thank you all for joining us online. Thank you to our team behind the scenes, and have a great rest of the day and continue with your work. Thank you.